Okay, hello everyone. My name is İpek Yosmoğlu. I'm the director of the Keyman Modern Turkish Studies program here at Northwestern University's Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. And I also am a member of the history department. And I think by now, most of you are sort of familiar with our events, and I'm going to keep the introduction short today because we have a 35-minute talk coming up. Very exciting talk, but not before I tell you a little bit about the upcoming events, because this is actually the first talk in a series of 3 on the theme of reflections on whiteness, blackness, and race in the Ottoman Empire and Republican Turkey. So we really would like you to check out our calendar, and I'm going to just give you the titles and the speakers now. All events, by the way, start at noon. It's easy to remember. So our next speaker in this series will be Ezgi Güner, and the title of her talk is Scramble for African Hearts, Muslim Whiteness, Islamic Civility, and Interracial Intimacy in AKP's Turkey. And then after that, this is on March 31st. Our third speaker in this series is Ezgi Çakmak, another Ezgi. And the title of her talk is The Roots of the Silence, Encounters with Blackness in the Early Turkish Republic. And we also have, I'll briefly mention, we have an event sponsored by the MESA Global Scholars Program, and Nina here is coordinating it. So it's on April 2nd. We'll have Melissa Bilal and Haydar Darıcı as our guests, and they'll be talking about political violence and self-defense in Turkey, history and ethnography. On April 19th, we have another guest. This time I'll be interviewing him, Mark David Barr. It's going to be about his one of his latest books, I think the latest one actually, Sultanic Saviors and Tolerant Turks. Last but not the least, please stay tuned for our conference, Queer Conditions, Queer Haller. It is going to be over 4 weekends in June. Again, it's going to be a Zoom meeting. You can find all of this information on our website if you just go to the Keyman Modern Turkish Studies Northwestern. And we, update these things regularly. Plus, today's talk will be recorded and we'll share it on our website. So if you want to tune in later, it will be there, and also for others. So finally, today we had some real issues with connectivity. They are always here, but today especially, I would like to specifically thank Andrew Baldowski and Robert Trujillo, and our program coordinator, Gina Steck, and also Deniz Durez, our postdoc at Keyman. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today, Professor Baki Tezcan, who teaches history at the University of California, Davis. And he is the author of more than 40 articles, I believe, and also a path-breaking book, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, titled The Second Ottoman Empire, Political and Social Transformation in the Early Modern Era. Nowadays, we're able to reach more people through Zoom, but there is something also lost when we do not have our speakers here. It's even more, bitter when your guest speaker is also one of your best friends from, not only from grad school, but also from college, I suppose, childhood friend. And so I'm going to take this opportunity also to let you know that Baki Tezcan is not only an accomplished scholar of history, but he's also an accomplished thespian, which you may not know. So I'm going to now let Professor Tezcan speak. after and during the talk, you can send your questions using the chat function to Deniz Druiz. Please direct them to Deniz Druiz. And she's going to collate them and direct them to Professor Tezcan after his talk. Thank you. Go ahead, Baki.
Thank you. Thank you for this great introduction, İpek. Thank you. Between the late 16th and mid-18th centuries, Black eunuchs rose to unprecedented prominence in the political structures of the Ottoman Empire. While this rise to power has finally drawn the attention it deserves in Jane Hathaway's recent book, The Chief Eunuch of the Harem, of the Ottoman Harem from 2018, the literary sources that reflect the complicated relationship between gender, race, slavery, and political power surrounding the African eunuchs await further study. The sources I would like to focus on in this presentation are 3 Ottoman works written in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Mirror for Ethiopians by Ali Mekki, Dispelling the Darkness on the Merits of Ethiopians by Mullah Ali, and the Halberdier's Treatise on the Affairs of the Chief Black Eunuch by Dervish Abdullah. I published an article on the first 2 14 years ago and compare certain aspects of these 2 works with the third one in another article 3 years ago. My purpose this afternoon is to emphasize the gendered presence of race in the early modern Ottoman palace, which represents the elephant in the room that Mullah Ali sheds light on rather directly. Before I enter the specific context of my work, however, I would like to talk about slavery in the Ottoman Empire a little bit, as it is impossible to appreciate the political dynamics of gendered relations of race in the palace without having an idea about the place of slavery in Ottoman society and its evolution in the early modern period. What we know about agricultural slavery in the Ottoman Empire suggests that slave labor was not a major component of agricultural production, with the exception of the ortakçı kullar, that is sharecropping slaves, whom one comes across in large estates belonging to the royal family and high-ranking administrative officers. The slavery one comes across in these instances looks more like the medieval European serfdom than the American plantation-type slavery. We do not have much evidence of African slaves used in agricultural production in the central lands of the Ottoman Empire until the 19th century, when they become common in some parts of Western Anatolia and Southern Anatolia. The Afro-Turks of today, and I imagine you'll hear about them in coming talks in this series, are descendants of these 19th century Africans. According to Ottoman economic historians, Ottoman slavery was more common in the household sector before that. Even though my work focuses on narrative sources, it is actually Ottoman court records where one comes across a great deal of data on slavery, including African slavery. As it happens, the results of some recent research on Ottoman slavery that focus on these records highlight the role of African slave trade played in the history of Ottoman slavery. Hülya Canbakal and Filiz Karlıtekin's study of the probate records at the court of Bursa, and if you're not familiar with where Bursa is, it's right here in the heart of the empire. It used to be the first capital of the Ottomans before the capital moved to Edirne and later to Istanbul. Filiz Tekin and Canbakal and Filiz Tekin focused on the period 1460 to 1880 in their study, and their research into the incidence of slave ownership and prices suggests a substantial decline in slave slaveholding already before the beginning of the government reforms concerning slavery and slave trade in the 19th century. So even though slavery was abolished and banned, etc., in the 19th century, we see a decline much before, in the 18th century. Their study also confirms Halil Sahilioğlu's earlier study of slaves employed in textile production in Bursa, a city that is still well known for its textiles. The most interesting outcome of their study is, however, the downward trend in slave prices that starts in the early 18th century. One would expect that with the beginning of Ottoman territorial losses in the Balkans, the inflow of slaves would be reduced, which would put pressure on the slave prices to rise. Yet, right around that time, one starts coming across ethnic origins of slaves to be recorded more consistently in court records. As the authors state, and the quotations are right there, a probable increase in the number and or share of the African slaves correlates with the downward trend in average prices. In all periods for which we have a reasonable number of observations, the price of African slaves is lower than that of the northern slaves from different parts of Eurasia. While changes in the volume of traffic from the two supply zones must have fostered opposite movement of the prices of African and Caucasian slaves, the presence of price differentials in the first place is where the demand begins to enter the picture. According to the authors, and I quote, these differences reflected long-established patterns of employment, Africans in menial jobs and domestic service, as opposed to West Eurasian slaves in military administrative jobs and domestic partnership concubinage, as well as domestic service. These patterns drew on a cultural system that attributed different qualities and aptitudes and thus labor roles and market value to slaves of different gender and origin. Hence, the higher value of fair-skinned slaves and desirability of such women all the way from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean and colonial America. I should add that Can Bakkal and Filiz Tekin have a forthcoming piece to be published in Turkish Historical Review entitled Slaveholding in Ottoman Central Lands, 1460 to 1880, that draws not only on Bursa, but also on Manisa and Trabzon, as well as Manastır, Kayseri, Aintab, and Diyarbakır, thus reaching to the Balkans as well as northern Mesopotamia. Their findings in this larger geographical sample confirm their findings in Bursa in terms of a continual decline in slave ownership and related indicators across all social groups and strata, and a decline in prices in connection with trafficking from Africa in the 18th century. Can Bakkal and Filiz Tekin studies help me make better sense of the third of my sources, the Halberdiers treatise, which I will touch upon later in my talk. Arguably, the findings of their study might even shed some light on the place African slaves had in the Ottoman slave elite. The Ottoman political leadership followed the centuries-old model of elite slavery that was developed in the Abbasid era when caliphs started importing Turkic slaves from Central Asia to rule over their dominions rather than depending on the local elites. They brought to it a new twist, however, the Ottomans, by practically enslaving some of their own Christian youth through the institution of the devshirme, or the collection, through which some of the young Christian subjects of the empire were converted to Islam and raised as soldiers or administrators. Some of their most celebrated ones became grand viziers and held sometimes more power than the sultans themselves, such as Sokollu Mehmet, who oversaw the transition of power from Süleyman to Selim II, from Selim II to Murat III, and keeping his position as a top minister for 14 years throughout. He was one of those slaves of the Sultan who kept his relations with his original family, some of whose members he raised to positions in the imperial administration as Muslims, and some of whom he raised in the Orthodox Church as Christians. Ottomans also had castrated slaves in the palace service. The chief was known as the Babüssade Ağası, the keeper of the Gate of Felicity, which refers to the gate that separated the interior part of the court from the exterior one. So if today you go into the Topkapı Palace, you will first enter the first court, which is open to the public, where you don't have to pay a ticket. And it was open to the public back in the Ottoman days as well. And then you you pay your ticket right here, and then you go through this. You are in the second court, which was not open to the public, but only open to officers and administrators in the Ottoman era. And then from there, if you move further, today you can pass this gate as a tourist, but back in the day you could not. Pretty much no one could, except with special permission or for special audiences. So that is where the Babu Sade was located. So today, if you go, it will be right here, the Babu Sade, the Gate of Felicity. So the interior part included the Sultan's residence as well as the dorms for the pages. That is the select Devshirme recruits whose best ones could graduate with a governorship from the palace school. The keeper of the Gate of Felicity not only guarded the gate to the third court of the palace, but was also responsible for the education of these pages. Once one crossed this gate, the only sexually active senior male who slept over in the interior part of the palace was meant to be the Sultan. As Leslie Pierce had emphasized, princes were not allowed to procreate until they would be sent to provinces in the 16th century, or after the passage of the seniority principle until they came to the throne in the 17th century. In the heavily gendered world of the Ottoman court, not only concubines of the Sultan, but also the young pages were spared from possible overnight interactions with any other senior males who could play the active role in a sexual act. That is why their educators were eunuchs, headed by the keeper of the Gate of Felicity, the ultimate supervisor of what Leslie Pierce called the male harem. The castrated slaves among the keeper's staff were eligible for graduating from palace with governorships. Some of these graduates became governors of Egypt, a position for which Ottoman sultans seem to have preferred eunuchs. Almost a quarter, that is 8 of the 34 governors who administered Egypt in the first 100 years of Ottoman rule, were eunuchs. And their combined governorships amounted to about 40 years, as many of them had longer tenures. Ottoman sultans might have trusted eunuchs more with the governorship of Egypt, as they would not have any offspring to enrich while governing this fiscally lucrative province. Egypt also became the preferred place of retirement for many eunuchs. The eunuch slaves of the Sultan who had a chance to graduate from the palace and attain administrative positions in the empire, such as the governorship of Egypt, were Western Eurasian or white eunuchs, even though the Ottoman palace employed many African eunuchs as well. Some sources suggest that a color-coded division of labor between the servants in the harem and those who were responsible for the education of the pages had already developed before the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. There is, however, also some evidence suggesting that the color-coded division might not have been as strict as it became later in the 16th century. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, however, there was a very clear delineation between white eunuchs who continued to serve in more public positions and black eunuchs who were employed in the residential part of the palace, serving the family of the Sultan and their concubines. While the chief white eunuch had more prestige than the chief black eunuch before the late 16th century, after the unprecedented empowerment of Habeshi Mehmed Ağa during the reign of Murad III, the most powerful eunuch of the Ottoman court became an African one. While there is a parallel in the empowerment of the chief black eunuch and the move of Murad III's private chamber from the male harem, that is the third court, it used to be at the corner of the third court, northeastern corner of the court, where today the treasury is displayed, to the female harem. So he moved his own bedroom to the location where the women's folk were, since Hurrem Sultan moved the old palace into the new. So from that moment, there is a sort of a parallel between Habeshi Mehmed Ağa's empowerment and this, and so some people think it is related to that, which very well might be, but we do see some more white eunuchs coming to the highest position of palace administration in the late 16th and early 17th century. So that suggests maybe the empowerment of Habeshi Mehmed was not just a matter of Murad III moving his bedroom. Either way, though, what clearly happened was now there was a chief black eunuch who had a lot of access to a lot of power. And even though they could not be appointed to outside positions, they could become kingmakers. They could play key roles in dethroning or enthroning sultans. To summarize and point out a parallel between the employment patterns of royal castrated slaves on the one hand and the slaves held by Ottoman commoners, one could state that Africans seem to have been preferred exclusively for domestic service, both inside the palace starting from the 16th century and outside the palace in the 18th century, while Western Eurasian slaves were employed for administrative tasks in the palace and both domestic and professional tasks outside the palace. Thus, Ottoman slavery was, at least to a certain extent, and maybe only in certain dimensions, racialized. Interestingly, the parallel between the palace and the society at large is also visible in the discontinuation of the practice of devshirme in the 18th century and the decreasing demand for slaves in Ottoman society at large. But I'm not quite sure one could make a whole from this connection. It's just, I'm throwing it out there. Within this matrix that privileges Western Eurasian slaves over African ones, the chief black eunuch starts holding an exceptional place from the late 16th century on as he becomes the chief administrator of the court, rising above the chief white eunuch, thus overturning the color-coded hierarchy, just as the Ottoman sultans start intervening in the higher-ranking administrative appointments much more frequently during the reign of Murad III. In making a move toward holding more control over appointments, Murad III and others following him strengthened the position of the chief black eunuch, whose job connected the private world of the sultan with the public world of the empire, thus creating an alternative focus of power that could rival the Grand Vizier. The chief white eunuch could potentially be a strong advocate for his former students, who graduated from the palace with appointments to rule districts and provinces of the empire, and later became viziers or grand viziers, whereas the loyalties of the chief black eunuch were undividedly focused on the sultan and his family, as it is they whom he served most closely and most directly. The three works I talk about today were produced in this political context to either support or critique the chief black eunuchs who came to have unprecedented political power between the late 16th and mid-18th centuries. The first of these four works, The Mirror for Ethiopians, was composed by Ali Mekki, who used to be a professor of law in Bursa in the last quarter of the 16th century. In 1587, he moved to Mecca with all of his extended family. He calls them 27 souls, and then returned to Anatolia in 1599. He looked for employment, and right at that time, we see Mustafa Agha as the chief black eunuch at the palace. He served from 1605 to 1620, and that was the reigns of Ahmed I, Mustafa I, and Osman II. And for instance, he was played a key role in the dethronement of Mustafa and enthronement of Osman II as an African man. So Ali Mekki, after his return from Mecca, was a professor in Bursa. Then he was offered a professorship in Medina but he declined that one. He didn't want to go back to Arabia. And 1604, he got a position in Istanbul. And in 1606, he reached the Sahna Saman, the College of Mehmed II, which is an important point in a legal career in the Ottoman Empire. So I speculate that he wrote this book either right before or right after, either to get this appointment or to thank for the appointment. to Mustafa Agha. And when we look at the Mullah Ali, the other author of the second work, we see similarly a professor of law, but this time not someone who was born free and lived a life as a free man, but rather an African man who was enslaved, sold to Aydınzade, somebody Mehmed, and then was given as a gift to Habeshi Mehmed Agha, the first chief black eunuch of the Ottoman court, who I guess sponsored Mullah Ali's education. And Mullah Ali came to be a professor at the College of Süleymaniye. And there he actually wrote the work that I will briefly touch upon today. I will not talk about these works in great detail because I already published on them. I want to emphasize one aspect that I didn't get a chance to emphasize before. Both of these authors drew on earlier Arabic sources, and that's where we find Muhammad bin Abdul Baqi. And the source that they used by this author is At-Tiraz al-Manqush fi Mahasin al-Qubush, the colored brocade on the good qualities of the Ethiopians. Muhammad bin Abdul Baqi had written this work, and here at the very beginning, he cites both his sources, earlier sources, and at the end, he cites to whom he dedicates his work. Abu Nasr Hussein was one of the sons of Hassan, the ruler of the Hijaz, whose father Abu Numayh had presented the keys of the holy cities to Selim I in Cairo in 1517. Thus, Ibn Abdul Baqi compiled his work for a local Arab prince who had many African slaves, as he explains us in his introduction. Ali Mekki, as an Anatolian professor of law with an appointment from Istanbul, might well have met Abu Nasr Hussein in the late 1580s when he immigrated to Mecca, where he most probably read this book, The Colored Brocade, and perhaps even met Ibn Abdul Baqi, yet he does not name it as one of his sources, even though he copies most of it in his work. Back then, they didn't have the idea of plagiarism so much, I guess. Ali seems to have, it didn't mean what it means to us today. Ali seems to have made some minor revisions in the structure of the book by moving some sections around. In terms of contents, he adopts most of Ibn Abdul Baqi's writing, adding a paragraph of his own here and skipping some paragraphs there. Ali Mekki's work is written in Arabic and Turkish, with Arabic sections followed by Turkish ones. The Turkish sections are more than simple translations of the Arabic ones, as they provide some added commentary. The difference between Ibn Abdul Baqi and Ali Mekki is in the degree of sensitivity to the question of color. For instance, Ibn Abdul Baqi cites the Curse of Ham story in this way, the way I share it on the slide right here. And Ali Mekki, when he comes to this point in the text, he paraphrases this, but then adds that the part about the change in Ham's skin color is an unfounded opinion. In the Turkish part of his text, he emphasizes once again that the curse of Ham is limited to them becoming slaves. It is quite likely that Ali Mekki, who was presenting his work to an African, Mustafa Agha, was more sensitive to describing blackness as the consequence of a prophetic curse than was Ibn Abdul Baqi, who was writing for an Arab prince who had African slaves. When Mullah Ali picked up the same topic as an African man himself writing for an African patron, he went a step further and also questioned the servile status ascribed to Africans in this curse, using mostly reason rather than tradition. I discussed this aspect of Mullah Ali's work in my earlier work. Today, I would like to focus on some other novelty Mullah Ali wrote, both to Ali Mekki and their common source, Ibn Abdul Baqi's The Colored Brocade. Even though Mullah Ali follows the organizational scheme of Ibn Abdul Baqi's The Colored Brocade. Overall, he introduces 6 new sections to the first chapter on the virtues of the Ethiopians. The first one of these sections is dedicated to the prophets and saints of African origin. As I argued elsewhere, this section is an indirect response to the assumption that the sons of Ham were all cursed to become slaves. Demonstrating that there were prophets of African origin is a refutation of the claim that the sons of Shem were destined to be prophets and the sons of Ham slaves. Mullah Ali goes back to earlier sources of the Arabic literary tradition devoted to the discussion of Africans and blackness in this section and claims, for instance, an Ethiopian heritage to the chronic Alexander the Two-Horned, Zulqarnain, which was also asserted by Ibn al-Jawzi, by the way. The other 5 new sections Mullah Ali adds to the first chapter of his book, however, are not to be found in the centuries-long Arabic literary tradition devoted to the discussion of Africans and speak directly to the gendered dimensions of being Black at the Ottoman court. The first one of them is on the reason why castrated men, or khasis, are called servants or khadims, and on things said about them by the Prophet and early caliphs. It starts with a most likely spurious report, according to which the Prophet is supposed to have said that servants are gatekeepers in heaven. The Arabic word for servants in this sentence is khuddam, the singular of which is khadim, that also came to carry the meaning of eunuch. Mullah Ali asserts that the Prophet had eunuchs in mind when he used the word servant, thus ascribing the contemporary usage to 7th century Mecca. In order to strengthen his argument, Mullah Ali cites other prophetic reports, one of which he cites on the authority of Abu Huraira, a companion of the Prophet. According to Abu Huraira, Abdul Rahman bin Auf, another one of the companions of the Prophet, used to have an African slave called Yasar. Every time he provided Yasar with some capital to engage in trade on his behalf, Yasar would sell the goods, keep enough of the proceeds to replace the capital, but spend the profit as charity on the poor. Abdul Rahman complained about this to the Prophet one day, referring to Yasar as a hasi, or a castrated man. The Prophet supposedly answered thus: "Oh, Abdul Rahman, do not call him hasi, call him khadim." Gabriel called him khadim and reported to me that God boasts with him to his angels, telling them, "See, I have that kind of a servant among the sons of Adam. Surely his rank in heaven is among those who have a high place there." Since the prophets called him a khadim, Mullah Ali continues, these people are called khadims, and all the positive prophetic reports about servants apply to them. In the other sections he adds to the first chapter of his book, Mullah Ali cites various prophetic reports and sayings attributed to early caliphs that censor castration and attest to the divine merits waiting those who are castrated. Reports the glorious deeds of eunuchs, talks about their virtues that exceed the virtues of others, and also reports cautionary sayings told about people who castrate slaves. The source of these sections Mullah Ali adds to his work are 2 treatises. The first one is Fadl al-Quddam wal-Khadam, or the virtue of eunuchs and servants, by a certain Abu al-Abbas Ahmad bin Abdul Malik al-Tanuhi al-Qatari. And the second one is the Manaqib al-Khuddam wal-Hisyan, or the glorious deeds of servants or eunuchs, however you want to translate it, and eunuchs, by a certain Abu Hassan Ali bin Ahmed bin Muhammad, known as Ibn al-Faqih, reminding one of the Persian geographer Ahmed bin Muhammad, who wrote at the turn of the 10th century and was known as Ibn al-Faqih. I was lucky enough to locate copies of these treatises in a manuscript from the late 16th century, perhaps the very one that Mullah Ali used himself. Yet I was unable to find anything else about the authors so far. What is striking is the ease with which Mulla Ali moves from the category of skin color or race to that of what I want to call gender here. In the introductory section of his book, where he lists his table of contents, his reference, these people, or Bu Taife, refers to Ethiopians in one section heading, while it refers to eunuchs in the next. We know very well that not all Ethiopians are eunuchs, or not all eunuchs are Ethiopians. For Mulla Ali's audience, however, all African slaves of the Sultan were indeed eunuchs. And eunuchs, while male, did not quite belong to the male gender. Here I follow Irvin Cemil Schick's introduction of the third gender into Ottoman studies of sexuality and applying it to eunuchs. Those of you who are familiar with studies on gender and sexuality in the Ottoman world would know that sexuality in Ottoman society was understood quite hierarchically, with senior males standing on top of the hierarchy with sexual access in an active role both to adolescent boys and women, to both of whom the passive role was assigned. Schick used the concept of the third gender with primarily the adolescent boys in mind, emphasizing their transgendered existence, as once they aged and grew beards, they would grow to the role of active participants in sex as senior males. And if you're interested in reading a romance that actually presents this theme so clearly, it's right here. It's in an edited version. The people in the image are not the people of the romance, but in the story, you see a senior mudarris having a junior man, adolescent, young, maybe late teens, early 20s. They have a love affair that actually even gets to involve the parents, who, after much protestation, actually end up accepting it, quite surprising maybe for our expectations of the 16th century. But at the very end, what happens is the younger one grows a beard, becomes a mudarris himself, and the love story comes to an end. Eunuchs, however, could not grow a beard, and they could never quite assume the active role that this kind of understanding expects from men. That is precisely why they were listed among the people who could be in close proximity to women in the Quran. Oh, I'm sorry. This is another image of the fact that you wouldn't grow a beard even if you already were like 19, 20, 21 in the palace. You could only grow a beard as you graduate from the palace. And this is for you images of pages who could grow their hair, but not beards. The Quranic verse is right here. So in the verse that's about the covering of a woman, you see a very specific description: male attendants who do not have any vigor for women. They were, eunuchs were the permanent embodiment of the third gender. In the sections Mulla Ali added to his work on Ethiopians, and we should read that as Africans, this lack of physical capacity to play the active role in sex receives some attention. While castration is censored strongly, castrated individuals are assigned an especially high status in the hierarchy of godliness, as they can dedicate themselves to the divine without any distraction. In the reports Mulla Ali cites, he goes as far as claiming that in a conversation God had with the prophet, God attributed them saintly status. In the context of the imperial palace, where Mulla Ali found his patronage, Africans were eunuchs. And even though Mulla Ali himself was not a eunuch, some of the European diplomats in Istanbul assumed that he was. Interestingly, Mulla Ali was known as Sümbül Ali, or Ali the Hyacinth, an epithet that definitely associated him with eunuchs, as I touched upon in my earlier work. Rather than avoiding this epithet, which associated him with emasculation, though, he seems to have owned it, as I came across to a marginal note on the Unicum manuscript of his book, which he signed as Li Muharririhi Ali Efendi, Ash-Shahir bi Sümbül Ali. As my colleague Abdülhamid Arbas drew attention in his recent work, gender and race were co-constituted in the case of African eunuchs at the imperial court, and Mullah Ali seems to have taken pride in his close association with them to the point of using that epithet, the epithet that his detractors might have named him with. Whether we see eunuchs with their assumed incompetence to be active role players in sex as belonging to the third gender, or consider them as a separate gender all to themselves, African eunuchs were the only men who were allowed access to both the Sultan and the royal woman, and the patronage dispersed by all of them. This particular positioning made these emasculated men more powerful than most in the early modern Ottoman period. Their power created envy as well. An 18th century work displays this envy in the most vicious way possible, demonstrating that even without a scientific understanding of race, one could be a racist. And because I came to the 30 minutes of my time, I'm going to move very fast here. Those of you who are interested could look at the second article I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that talks about all of this in some detail. We see in this work a certain Dervish Abdullah, who seems to have a grudge against Bashir Agha, the chief black eunuch of the time, and he just goes at Africans so viciously that the likes of which you would probably have not seen anywhere else in Ottoman literature or any work that is in Turkish. He creates a genealogy of evil in blackness that has antecedents even before blackness appears in the sort of Islamic cosmology of the world. He rewrites the Noah story. He rewrites several stories that we know from the sort of prophetic life stories of the Islamic tradition. And then he turns Ham into a rebel against Noah, who also learns about magic. And then his descendants do all the terrible things. Nimrod is bad because there were black magicians. The Pharaoh was bad because he used black eunuchs at his palace. It was black people who turned Meccans from the monotheism of Abraham. You name it. He goes into ancient Persian history, also brings evil black people into that story. He literally rewrites everything we know about many Islamic stories to cast blacks as embodiments of evil. So that is the guy that he was really having a big trouble with. And I thought that is how we should mainly interpret it. But now I wondered, though, whether Dervish Abdullah had not made all of these stories himself up, but drew on a slightly larger circle of oral literature that might have developed in parallel to the proliferation of African slaves in Ottoman slave markets that one observes in John Bakal and Phyllis Tekin's study I referred to at the beginning of this talk. I will leave this question for another study or a younger scholar to handle in the future. Abdullah's final advice to the Sultan is quite predictable. So the Sultan should expel the black eunuchs from his palace. According to him, this is not simply necessary because of all the evil deeds of black eunuchs in Islamic history, but also it is required according to the Sharia, as the protection of the Sultan's female servants necessitates the dismissal of eunuchs from palace service. And here comes a very interesting story. Abdullah claims that black eunuchs are not devoid of sexual desire and relates an anecdote about two of his comrades from the corps of halberdiers who were married to two former female slaves from the palace. These comrades apparently divorced their wives a week after marrying them, because their wives told them they could not find the pleasure they used to find in the black eunuchs in their husbands. Moreover, according to Abdullah, there is really no difference between young men, old men, or eunuchs in terms of limitation of access to one's female slaves. just like Mullah Ali combined the African descent of his patrons with their specific gender that he chose to describe asexually, the racist text of Dervish Abdullah ascribed an insatiable lust to Africans. And I skip those parts where he talks about how some of them prostrates in front of vulvas. They make kids, they do have sex all naked out in the open like pigs. And there's a language there that you would not want your young child to hear. So Dervish Abdullah ascribed his lust to Africans, which he also passed on to eunuchs, attributing to them sexual skills that his sexually active senior male comrades did not possess. In short, the gender and sexuality of the African Ottomans who carried the highest political profile between the late 16th and mid-18th centuries were an inseparable component of their racial identity, whether you loved them or hated them. In this particular sense, the African eunuchs at the Ottoman imperial court provide us with a perfect case of intersectionality, a term that was coined by the Black feminist scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. Their gender, race, and sexuality constituted their sociopolitical identity, which was at the root of both the discrimination they experienced and the privileges they enjoyed in the early modern Ottoman world. As the early modern era, when the personality of the ruler and the institution of the state were so closely intertwined, came to a close, the African eunuchs lost their political power. The imperial administration of the Ottoman state moved to the Sublime Porte, outside the confines of the imperial palace. The closure of the early modern era rendered the third gender or non-normative genders less acceptable as well. 19th century Ottoman works started displaying a certain degree of defensiveness about late medieval and early modern Ottoman male sexuality. The chapters dedicated to eunuchs in Mullah Ali's work then are a reminder to both the gendered existence of Africans in the Ottoman palace and a sociopolitical context in which men who did not fit into the definition of the male gender proper could still find a place in respectable literature produced by a professor who taught at the College of Suleiman the Magnificent and later became the Chief Justice of the Empire. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Tezcan, for this wonderful talk. I will start with the questions posted in the chat, and please, I would like everyone else who has a question to keep posting them. The first question is from, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Thaddeus Dawad. Thank you so much for your rich and exciting talk, Baki. I'm an art historian interested in the representation of Blackness in Ottoman painting. You showed us a few great miniatures featuring court eunuchs today. I'm wondering if you could speak more about the role of such images in the production of Ottoman notions of Blackness in the early modern period. It seems artworks and aesthetic discourse could be important sources to pair alongside the texts you shared today, since race in such sources generally discussed as in terms of color, pointing us to the questions of pigment, etc.
That's a great question. That's something I was myself thinking about. I'm afraid I don't have, okay, right here. In this image right here, you see some shades of black. Let's see, the image that Jane Hathaway used, you see one, the chief black eunuch right here. I'm looking whether I have another image that I thought I had, but no, I don't have that one. There is another one where the shade of black is very black. And what I noticed overall is that when a group of eunuchs are sort of put together, the color is a little darker. But then when we focus on sort of the chief black eunuch, especially here, we see a slightly lighter pigmentation. And that is more or less the case also in this one image we have of Mullah Ali himself. This is actually Mullah Ali. It is from a British Museum or British Library album from early 17th century that actually identifies the people that it depicts by name, and we know this is meant to be Mullah Ali. It was Tülün Değirmenci who first brought this to my attention, and I'm grateful to her. So here you see slightly lighter than full dark complexion. And I am sort of kind of like thinking and speculating that this is related to rendering the Africans as Ethiopians. Because if you render an African as an Ethiopian, if you introduce an African as an Ethiopian into the Ottoman context, where geographical knowledge of the world comes from the Islamic tradition that also has some Islam in it, Islamic history in it, Ethiopia makes it possible to claim an original Islamic heritage because of the story related to the Prophet during the time of the Prophets, right? If you actually, this story is also sometimes told in the connection with the Satanic Verses incident, but it is not related to that incident directly. A group of Meccans run away from Mecca because of the pressures that they face for accepting Islam and becoming Muslims. They run away to Ethiopia, to the Christian king there, who then accepts them and welcomes them. So that story becomes the kind of a genesis story for Islam in Africa. Some people claim the descendants of those people who moved there continue to be Muslim. And so, for instance, when Mullah Ali talks about Habeshi Mehmed Agha, he claims that Habeshi Mehmed Agha came from the people who had converted to Islam back in the time of the Prophet and sort of lived in Ethiopia, etc. So that provides them with a more illustrious history. Being Ethiopian brings you to the heart of Islamic history rather than, as a result of it, you enter Islam not just as slaves, but descendants of people who were Muslim in the first place, right when Islam started. And I think the lighter pigmentation is a sort of way of signaling that, signaling being Ethiopian rather than being sort of sub-Saharan African. And I have a feeling that to a certain extent, this might also have been adopted by people like Mullah Ali himself to sort of present a more Ethiopian heritage, the lighter skin color, the better. You can see in between the lines of his texts that he himself had perhaps inadvertently taken that kind of view of color. I'm saying perhaps inadvertently because I'm not quite sure. Actually, maybe we need to think about it a little bit more, how much of a self-acceptance of this white norm, and the lighter the better, would have been here as well, because in many places of his text, Mullah Ali is clearly standing against that. He says, God didn't say the most, the best among you is the most the best looking one or the whitest one. He says it's the most pious one. So he makes that claim. But on the other hand, by simply putting the best looking one and the whitest one together, he also seems to reflect to a certain extent the expectations of the society in which he lives in. So that is why I tend to think the lighter pigmentation might specifically be assigned to chief eunuchs to mark them as slightly higher status Africans, as Ethiopians. I know this might not have been the exact answer you were looking for, but because I'm not an art historian, I sort of answered the question in a way that attracted my attention in it, and that is related to these different pigmentations, what they signify. Are they all black, the same black, or some of them are lighter black than others? And I tend to think the ones who come to the top have a slightly lighter tone, as we see here in Mullah Ali, and more clearly we see in this one here, in Mehmet Abad. Okay, I spoke enough. I'll stop right here.
Our second question in the chat is, what percentage of Black slaves were bought by wealthy landowners and brought back returning from the Hajj?
Oh my God, I have no idea. I'm afraid I cannot answer that question, but I saw that Hülya Canbakal is among the audience, and perhaps she would have an anecdotal story to tell about this. Are there more African slaves in people who are recorded as Hajis? Hülya, have you ever come across to anything like that?
I am asking to unmute you. Yeah.
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Hülya, go ahead, please.
Oh, hi. Well, unfortunately, I wish. I mean, we have some probate inventories that belong to people who died on the way back from the Hajj, but never seen a slave mentioned in the person's possessions, among the person's possessions. So that's a, very difficult question to answer. No idea.
Thank you. If you can't answer, then I have a very good, reason to say it's impossible to answer. I'm sure there could be a way, but we don't know it yet. So maybe we'll find one day. Any other stories?
Yeah, we have a question from Irvin Schick. It's actually a comment. Concerning the role of artistry in the production of race, I argued in my book, Cherkes Güzeli, that the character of the fair Circassian played a key role in the European definition of whiteness. Perhaps you would like to comment on that?
Irvin Bey, I'm very sorry. Deniz, do you mind just repeating what you wrote?
It's also in the chat box.
Can I see it? Okay, great. That would make it better, because I process English questions much better if I can see them, except my chat box doesn't open. Oh, okay. Concerning the role of artistry in the production of race, look at my book, the character of the fair circle played a key role in the... Oh, yes. Oh, that is wonderful. I don't know enough to make an educated commentary here. However, I can say that what I have written on Blackness and Africans found its way to Hamid Arvas's work, Abdülhamid Arvas, and he sort of pointed how the eunuch character in the plays that you find in the English drama scene in the late 16th, early 17th century is very much the product of Ottoman eunuchs, and how English travelers, diplomats, etc., carried this image into Europe, and then it found its way onto the stage directly. And he makes this very clearly, so I can see how, as Irvin Bey points out, the Circassian, the fair Circassian, might have found its way into Europe through Ottoman as well. But I am not, an expert enough to tell whether that would be the only source, because it appears to me that a fair skin has been sort of found in many instances in very different parts of the world as among white people mostly, as a sort of status symbol, high status symbol. But that is definitely a good thing that one could carry further. Yes. Irvin Bey, please. I would love to hear what you have to say on on thinking about eunuchs through third gender, or anything else you would like to add? Please, Irvin Bey, please.
I just wanted to add to my comment that it's been discussed a great deal in recent decades that race is a construct, that there is basically no real biological basis to race and so forth. And in general, these arguments take as their starting point the idea that blacks are a foil and the opposite of whites. Therefore, that blacks are the basis for these definitions. And I try to argue in the book that just as much as blacks, in fact, there is also the construction of whiteness, and that in fact, the reason that we refer to whites as Caucasians comes precisely from the 18th and 19th century European literature, where Georgians and Circassians were portrayed as extremely beautiful and extremely white, and that this idea went into constructing whiteness and therefore Caucasianness. So that's all I wanted to say.
Irvin Bey, thank you so much. And I am embarrassed I haven't read your book, but now—
You're not the only one.
Now that you mentioned it so clearly, I'm going to bring it in because it really helps make the case even better. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Leila Purtava. Were there no white eunuchs who occupied the harem of the Sultan?
That is a great question, and I think there were at some point, because for instance, when Hürrem Sultan moves from the old palace to the new palace, she has white as well as black eunuchs. And so that is why I said this color-coded division between white eunuchs and black eunuchs, how that developed. Did it really exist so strongly from very early on? I'm not sure, I said. I think Gülru Necipoğlu suggests that the very small harem that the new palace originally had. So when Mehmet II conquers Constantinople, he builds what they later came to be called the Old Palace, Eski Saray, in what is today Istanbul University grounds. And then he builds the new palace, what is today the Topkapı Sarayı, Topkapı Palace, later in his reign. And most of the women remain in the old palace. And in the new palace, there is a very small section for concubines of the Sultan, and that section is right next to the private chamber of the Sultan, which is at the northeastern corner, where the private chamber pages and their dorms are located, which is today the treasury department of the palace. So right there to the west of the private chamber, apparently there was a small, very small harem for women, and that harem was indeed guarded by African eunuchs. So I guess even though some in the woman's palace, there might have been some white eunuchs serving the woman as well, in the Ottoman new palace, the eunuchs at the gate of the woman's small compartment were African, all black. And then Hürrem Sultan moves to the new palace, then develops the harem as we know it. And then when Murad III is the Sultan, he leaves his private chamber at that northeastern corner and moves into the harem. And then from that moment on, it's very clear only black eunuchs are serving in that section. However, a powerful woman could probably have other servants who help him with her work outside, with her investments, with her finances, etc. And perhaps in that capacity, a white eunuch might also be employed, maybe. But as far as we know, this division of color-coded division among the eunuchs becomes very strict, at least from the late 16th century on, if not earlier. and the women's folk live in the part of the palace where only black eunuchs serve, and the pages live in the part of the palace where white eunuchs serve them.
Our next question is from Afsana Kalantari. I am concerned as to whether we can project the modern concept of race onto the past. And in my capacity as moderator, I would like to add one little question to this. It seems like we have a lot of terms that we are talking about here: Ethiopians, Africans, Black, and I was wondering if Blackness or race, if we are talking about race, could apply to other peoples of the empire, like Arabs or other people on the fringes of the empire.
This is an excellent question. And I must say, I was thinking along the lines of a negative answer to this question when I wrote my first article on this topic, Dispel the Politics of Race. I put it in quotation marks, and I was very sensitive not to use the term in the modern sense. I thought a graduate seminar in which we sort of looked at pre-modern sort of discussions of race and color in the Islamic world, going back all the way to the Zenj revolt during the Abbasid era. There was actually a time when African slaves were used very much like plantation slaves in the Abbasid era in parts of Iraq, but those slaves revolted, and that production, that agricultural production that was using slave labor in the way of plantation slavery almost, it came to a halt. And after that, we didn't see similar wide-scale use of African slavery in big production, agricultural production things. So in those contexts, I was very careful not to use the term race because race, as we know it today, we tend to think of it as a construct of the 19th century related to modern science, the development of biology. And yet, when I came to that 18th century text and then read it and then thought about it, I still was not so sure whether or not I could use it. That's why I think I introduced the text in the article I wrote as, if this text were written today, we would call it racist. So I was still trying to make a differentiation between modern construction of race and pre-modern. But since then, I've been thinking more and more about this text, and yes, it is not biological. The author, Dervish Abdullah, does not know like biology and genetics. He hasn't studied, he's not aware of Darwin or anything. And yet, using genealogy rather than biology, he comes up with a history of humanity in which evil and good are represented through heritage. I couldn't get into the details of it. If you read the article, you'll see it. He sort of posits goodness in Adam's, was it the third son? So there's Abel, Cain, and Seth, right? So the one who kills his brother, Cain, so his offspring always end up being evil. And the one who's born after that brotherly murder, Seth, I think, his offspring ends up always being good. Noah is someone who comes from the good offspring, but then his sons who are good sons, Sem and Japheth, they are born to his wife who also comes from the good offspring, but Ham, Dervish Abdullah makes him born to the wife who came from the bad offspring, from Cain's offspring. So he builds literally like a genealogical tree for evil, and then embodies this evil in Black people after sort of as a result of Noah's curse, Ham's color becomes black. So when I read that text and think about it, more and more I came the line between genealogical understandings of skin color and race and biological understandings of skin color and race could get very blurry in the hands of someone like Dervish Abdullah, who really was decidedly sort of keen on making all Black people look terrible in his writings. So that's why I thought, I'm more and more thinking, while that is an important distinction to remember, that race as we know it today is a modern concept and we need to understand it within the context of the development of science, 19th century science. There were occasions in the pre-modern world when people could develop very strongly articulated ideas that without biology, using genealogy, that have more or less the same implications. That's why, even though I would like to keep that nuance, still I would like to keep that nuance, I'm not quite sure how strong of a line we can draw anymore. I'm sorry, this was a very long answer maybe. And then Deniz, I ended up not answering quite your question. Are there like other sort of ethnic writings, I think you were asking?
Is there any reference to other peoples of the Ottoman Empire in terms of race or Blackness?
Not so much. In these writings, you do find black and white used. White and black is used in Mulla Ali and in Dervish Abdullah. You do find them, but you don't necessarily. However, I could tell you that Arab is used as a synonym for black. So, for instance, when they talk about Ali, Mulla Ali, they call him sometimes Sümbül Ali. Sometimes they call him Arab Sümbül. So in that context, Arab is stands for black. So which tells you that the people who use that vocabulary sees Arabs as somewhat closer to blacks than themselves. So I think it is possible to think about certain gradations in the conceptions of Ottoman elite, the Rumi elite. And if you look at slave manuals written with a view to instruct upper class people in buying slaves, you find a whole list of characteristics assigned to particular ethnicities. And so again, we see there sort of the kernels of the ideas that are related to modern conceptions of ethnicity, and I would even say to a certain extent race, especially when one combines the use of Arab as black with Arab as an ethnicity. I think there is a certain sense there. And the color issue comes up in geographical works, in geographical explanations of skin color. They say if you are on the north, you get less exposed to the sun, so you are a little too light. If you're in the south, you are too much exposed to the sun, so you grow very dark. The right place to grow is the middle, which is, you know, the Mediterranean region. So that is where the right people, that is the Rumi people, come from, according to their understanding, which of course goes back to earlier Islamic sources also.
Oh, great, thank you.
Hamid is right there. Hamid's hand is up. We should let him talk because Hamid is my favorite guy in these kinds of issues. Hamid, please.
Yes, sorry.
You have to turn on your, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, now I wasn't able to earlier. Okay, thank you so much, Baki Hocam. You know how much I love your work and I'm closely following. So I'm not gonna say anything because you are saying everything, but I have a question that your talk today made me even think race in a more complicated way, that is the relationship between race and religious difference. And you know, in England, like race is not only related to skin color, but thinking about medieval and early modern anti-Semitism. or Muslims being associated or called Moors or blackamoors and being kind of racialized in England. And in some work on Ottoman slavery, there was just like whether this Christian converts or devshirme can really be Muslim or not. You know, we have this kind of stories. And Shouki Al-Hamel's Black Morocco book talks about how in the Morocco and in Arabic-speaking context, there appears a discourse in the early modern period whether sub-Saharan Africans can really be Muslim or not. So I was wondering if you have anything to say, because this unique or Black writings we are talking are trying so hard to make Black population a part of Islamic history and their contribution to Islam. So I was wondering if there's an anxiety that Blackness, especially sub-Saharan Blackness, being associated with kind of like incapability of being true Muslim, therefore they can be enslaved. So I was wondering if you have anything to say about religious difference, race, and uniquism in that sense.
I think the issue you're raising is much more acute in Africa. The issue you raised, there was a 17th century North African Muslim scholar who went to great lengths to argue that skin color cannot be a basis for slavery, that there are many Muslim Africans who should not be enslaved because Muslims cannot be enslaved. I think I want to say, he was a Baba, I want to say Ahmed Baba maybe, Hamid, you would remember him.
Yeah.
So he went to great lengths in that, and he was making that point precisely because Muslim Africans were being enslaved. And the example you're giving is a major example that happened in Morocco, where a lot of Africans were enslaved to create a Black army later in later 17th century. So there was that discussion clearly was very pertinent in North Africa, Northwestern Africa. In the case of the Ottomans, if such a discussion took place, it would happen sort of in the Ottoman Habesh, in the Ottoman Ethiopia province, south of Egypt. And I'm not quite sure. I don't want to rule it out because one would have to, these are the kind of questions that because people don't ask them, we don't go look at the sources for precisely looking for this. I mean, if you ask this question and then you take it as a dissertation project, you might then go to fatwa collections that perhaps originate from Arabia, a little closer in geography to Habesh, etc., and then look whether or not these questions came up in these fatwa collections, and then one would develop a better sense. But in the writings that I studied, which are narrative sources, and in that, what I see, there is definitely an anxiety on the part of Mullah Ali to prove that the servile status of Africans is not there because of a prophetic curse. He does want to make that very clear, and he spends some time and energy doing that. But I'm not quite sure whether he does this because there is a lot of enslavement of Muslim Africans actually happening and he cares for that, or he does this because he wants to posit his patrons and himself not as belonging to a race that was meant to be servile, but rather a group of people who are proud Muslims from times immemorial, from the time when Islam first started. So in short, there is definitely an anxiety, but I'm not quite sure whether the anxiety is a response to actual enslavement of Muslim Africans. Whereas that was the case in Northwest Africa, I'm not quite sure. Again, studies like Hülya's or other people who might focus more specifically on where are these African slaves coming from could change this answer if actually we find evidence of such a thing happening. But as far as I know, we don't have that yet out. So as a result, I would be hesitant to say that is the case. But maybe a future projects of as a PhD student might prove me wrong by showing us that there were similar discussions happening in East Africa as well. I am afraid right now we don't know. Thank you.
We have 5 more minutes until the end of our event. And this question is from the 3rd speaker of our series, Ezgi Çakmak. She says, thank you for the great presentation. I would like to ask how prevalent was the use of African eunuchs outside the imperial palace in the late 17th and 18th century?
This is again the kind of question that Hülya would be able to answer much better than me. The little bit that I heard from her anecdotally suggested to me that eunuchs were very expensive because it involves castration. So it is sort of like a not easy kind of slave to buy, because but Hülya should tell us more herself since she's here. I don't want to put words into her mouth she might disagree with. Hülya, do you want to say a few things? Were there any eunuchs you can?
I wish I had something to say. It is true that eunuchs were very expensive, apparently, and this is not from my own work, but rather from secondary literature. I've encountered only one black slave, which was very, very expensive, and I simply assumed that he must be a eunuch. And notably, though, this person was from the 16th century, and it was exceptional to identify slaves by, in the sources that I use, exceptional to identify the slaves by origin. But this person was identified as a, I don't remember the word, the term used, but the specific term used, but we understand that he was black. And but this tells us nothing about how or if they were used outside the palace. They were employed outside the palace. That I have no evidence about that.
I would think that there would be eunuchs outside the palace, but I think it would be limited to really upper class, big households that have a lot of financial resources that could afford actually buying a eunuch. And that is my sort of gut feeling, but obviously gut feeling is not really a good scientific answer. Perhaps, again, more studies of the kind that Hülya and Filistekin, her colleague, did together, Alpay Filistekin, which actually goes into these court records, find things, and then a systematic look at them might show us eunuchs and the kind of income to have eunuchs in your household. I would guess it could be possible in a vizierial household where you have tons of money, but I don't find it likely you would find a eunuch in a household of a professor. I would think there would be house servants, but probably not eunuchs. Although Hülya's study suggests in the 18th century there were more Africans in the market. Who knows? Maybe that developed as well, but I don't know, I'm afraid.
Okay, I would like to thank everyone for these wonderful questions and the very multifaceted conversation that came up with the many experts in the room. So Professor Tezcan, are there any more final words that you would like to say?
Oh, nothing. I just want to thank Hülya, Hamit, and Ervin Bey for actually coming and helping us understand things better. I'm especially embarrassed toward Ervin Bey, and one of the first things I'll do before I talk about this topic again will be to read his book. Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Yasmoğlu, are there any last words from you?
Okay, I think I successfully managed to unmute myself. I love it when we invite one speaker and then, you know, suddenly we have more than one. This was wonderful, and thank you all. Thank you, Baki, for this wonderful presentation, but also the participants who turned their cameras on and actually when they were called on answered. This was really enlightening, and I hope that you know you will be participating in this conversation going forward. Like I said, we have 2 more talks coming up, and you know would love to see you there. Thank you all.